the phrase is, if you're going to eat crow, make sure you eat it while it's young and tender, right? Don't let it grow up to be an adult.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Beneath the Law. My name's Gavin I'm here with my good friend, partner, and colleague, Stephen Teal, where we try to dissect and look beneath some of the surface stories of legal precedents in society. And we don't stick around in Canada. We go all over the world looking at things. And this week we're going to talk about a poor fellow, if you read the media story, who wasn't such a poor fellow after all, who got fired from his job, looks like a very good job, in London, England, for not eating, a sandwich in Amsterdam. Talk about an international flavor with a very real consequence for this individual in England. This story gained quite a bit of notoriety around the world as people, I think, chuckled to themselves about this guy who was fired about the phony sandwich that he tried to expense for his partner, who he had brought along with him on a business trip, but apparently didn't want to pay for his or her lunch. So that was the story that was in the media, that fellow fired over his sandwich. But really it brings into light, Stephen, what I think is a much, much larger issue, which is the foundation of the employee-employer relationship, which really is a social and psychological contract, if you will, that consists of beliefs about reciprocal obligations between the two parties. And that's a very convoluted and legalistic way to describe what is a relationship of trust. And we hear a lot about rights from, if you listen to any media, there's employment lawyers are always on the radio or on television or on the internet talking about enforce your rights, etc. But with any rights come a reciprocating and concomitant, if you will, responsibility. And there's rights and responsibilities, to my mind, are always two sides of the same coin. And in any legal relationship, there are always reciprocating rights and reciprocating responsibilities between the parties. And that's what this sandwich was really about.
Yeah, it's, I'm glad this case was brought to our attention. It's like we're, when I grew up, wide world of sports, right? We're the wide world of law. We're spanning the globe to find interesting legal cases to talk about. And although the context of this decision is England, and it's a case that you can actually find online through the employment tribunals in England, because the media report actually didn't do justice, in my view, to the employer in this case. And there's a couple of things that you raise, Gavin, in the introduction. Obviously, the foundational principles of the employer-employee relationship, the duties of loyalty, faithfulness of the employer, of the employee to the employer, and that overriding contractual obligation between an employee and an employer. So that is foundational in any jurisdiction. But more importantly, when, we call this podcast Beneath the Law, specifically to look at a story that people were reading in the media, and you got to have a lot of sympathy for this worker who gets fired because of what one would think is a minor indiscretion. But when you examine the case, it was very interesting to see that it wasn't just one meal that he had expensed on this business trip to Amsterdam. It was a few meals, and there was an actual process and an internal investigation going on by the employer, which was a bank. Obviously, when you read the story, big bad bank. but they went through a process and asked this employee, who was, by the way, a financial analyst in their criminal
a financial
fraud.
crime,
Right.
financial crimes analyst.
Exactly.
He was a cop, basically.
He was in risk management and oversight. The bank certainly is placing a high level of integrity in this individual, or expecting that he has a high level of integrity. And so he files this expense report, or expense reports, with respect to these meals. There's a policy in place. The bank has a clear policy that spousal expenses are not allowed. They can't be reimbursed. And then they question him. And there's a series of emails, an internal investigation. The bank sets up a discipline committee. I guess this is the way that they kind of do it in England, to properly investigate what happened. He even appeals that decision, and throughout, or for the most part, he continues to deny that anybody else ate the sandwich or had the coffee, until he finally admits it, and then basically tries to explain it away, that he was under health pressures. His grandmother had died. He was not feeling well. Really didn't understand the process, etc., etc. So that's the context of this decision. And when you read the decision, which is about 20 pages long, I got to tell you, Gavin, I have less sympathy for him.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that your comments raise two pretty important issues that our listeners should really think about. And it's one of the things that, if you're involved in the legal profession and you read about cases, it's amazing sometimes what the media outlines is happening in a case, because it really often has very little to do with the case itself. And in this particular instance, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a pretty boring story if someone gets fired because they're a liar, which is ultimately, in my view, exactly why this individual got fired. He didn't get fired because he wrongly expensed a sandwich. That wasn't the issue. The issue was he lied about the expensing of the sandwich. And then not only did he lie about it, he doubled down on it, not once, but twice, but 3 times in writing, saying, "Oh, no, I didn't eat my breakfast that morning. I needed 2 sandwiches." It was beyond the pale of liar, pants on fire. And it comes back to my point that underlying the employment relationship, going both ways, there has to be a relationship of trust and confidence between the employer and the employee. If you expect your employer to treat you fairly and properly, surely any person would say, if I expect to be treated that way, I will treat whomever is on the other side of that relationship in the same fashion. And just to highlight that point, I just quote from the case, picking up on the point that this individual was not only a employee of what the court referred to as a, quote, highly regulated financial sector that requires its employees to act with utmost integrity at all times, but he was in fact a financial crime analyst dealing with a financial institution where people are defrauding by using fake things like, invoices and expense reports. Financial institution, that his job was to catch people who did that, yet he was doing the very same thing. And I think, in fairness, that what came through to me when you read the decision was, if he'd fessed up to this immediately, say, "You know what, you're right, sorry about that. My partner was with me, put her sandwich on there," they would have said, "Tisk, tisk, you don't do that. We're going to deny that part of the expense report." It would have been, peanuts in terms of the amount and issue. But that wasn't the reason why he was terminated, in my view. The reason why he was terminated was because he doubled down on the original dishonesty And in an effort to cover it up and, frankly, probably get the money, he continued to lie about the expense report, which was, as I said, a nothing burger, if I can take the sandwich analogy a little further. But it's the cover-up. The cover-up is the killer, not the original crime.
Yeah, the cover-up on his part, the continuing to lie or answer vaguely the clear questions that were put to him by the bank employees who were investigating the expense reports, really, look, it made his story less credible and certainly raised the level of what was a minor indiscretion to a very severe kind of conduct in the view of the employee. And it's a bank. I mean, let's face it. That is a industry that requires its employees to have high degrees of honesty in their conduct, high levels of integrity, because they're dealing with, the financial information of individuals. They're giving out money. They're making loans, mortgage loans, etc. So banks do expect their employees to have that high level of honesty and integrity. And this guy here, in this case here, this financial analyst, was given every opportunity by the investigator. The investigator reminded him during the investigation of the bank's policy, and he continued to say that no one else consumed the meals that he was trying to expense.
Yeah, no, he said he did. He it wasn't that he, there's a lot of findings in what is obviously a lengthy decision, but he specifically said, no, I was hungry and I ordered 2 of everything. It was absurd. And as I said it again, let me just quote from you. I mean, this did not make its way into the media story. And in fairness, look, we live in an age, and this is really where I raised the second point that I mentioned earlier, was when you're reading media stories about legal cases, you got to do it with a grain of salt. We have, fortunately or unfortunately, we live in an age where media is, to some extent, infotainment, if I can call it that, and boring stories don't get a lot of clicks. Some, bank employee, high-level bank employee, he was at a management-level employee, getting fired for a sandwich. I'm going to read that story. But a bank employee who gets fired for, let me quote the case, someone employed in a position of trust in a global financial institution where, quote, even if the expense claim had been filed under a misunderstanding, there was an obligation upon the claimant to own up and rectify the position at the first opportunity. I accept that the respondent requires a commitment to honesty from its employees. No one's clicking a link that says, I expect that a global financial institution requires honesty from its employees. I can't think of anything more boring. So you just go back to the point, okay, there's got to be more to the story in order for someone to be terminated. No one's getting terminated over a sandwich. Obviously, there's more to it, and sure enough, there is. And when you get into the cases, when you go beneath the law, you start to see that there's always something more to it.
Yeah, for sure. In the context of this case, look, in the Canadian context, there are very similar decisions. There have been decisions where someone very similarly situated to this financial analyst, cheated on some internal examination. Was a former police officer working, I think, for the Toronto Stock Exchange, and was then terminated from that position because they found that he had, I think, copied somebody else's answers or what have you on this examination, and the court said no, that justifies dismissal. There are certain banking cases, there are certain other expense forms cases. There was an employee that filed a $300 mileage expense. I mean, not a heck of a lot of money, but did it in retribution because the employer wouldn't pay a $300 membership fee. And so filed a false expense with respect to that. That breached the trust in the employment relationship and was upheld as being a justified dismissal. So, first of all, in terms of a takeaway from this, an employee needs to be honest in their work. They shouldn't be attempting to, I guess, cheat their employer out of funds, even if it's just a minor expense. I mean, in this case, here, this financial analyst, the expense that he was filing for was within the policy in terms of the value. And it was what, $140 or $150 a day? Like, we're not talking about a lot of money. But why, put yourself in a position where you're filing a false expense, and then when somebody questions the expense, lie about it?
Yeah, I come back to, I think that's the key point. I mean, so we look at it in terms of some of the cases you mentioned, and in Canada, and I think in the UK as well, from reading this decision, the court takes what's referred to as a contextual approach, and intention matters. And so it really does take, almost an element from the criminal law of what's referred to as mens rea. What is the intention behind the act? There's no doubt that if I file a phony expense report, or an exaggerated expense report, I've committed a crime, or I've committed an error, or I've breached a policy. I've done the deed. That expense report is not accurate. Why I did that matters. Why I filed that expense report may or may not justify a termination. So, for example, if I'm just a bad bookkeeper, or it made a legitimate error that I put in that expense, and now that you brought that to my attention, I'm sorry, I'm withdrawing that immediately. My mistake. If I do that, I'm not going to get fired. That's not a dishonesty. If it's plausible that I've simply made a mistake, or I've disorganized, or what have you, that's generally speaking not going to be grounds for termination. But if knowing that the expense report is brought to my attention, and I double down on it, saying, "No, I was really hungry. I ordered 2 lunches rather than not one," that's where I'm going to get into trouble. That's the kind of behavior that goes to what the core, I say, of the employee-employment relationship is, which is one of trust. And when I start to lie, the trust is gone. You cannot trust a liar. And fundamentally, that completely destroys the basis of the employment-employee relationship and gives the employer, in my view, cause potentially for termination.
Absolutely. Now, looking at it from the perspective of employees, look, none of us, I think, can proclaim to be perfect. We all have our flaws, and we sometimes exercise poor judgment. And that's really what a court assesses in cases of dishonesty, where an employee has committed a dishonest act. You talked about the contextual approach, which looks at the circumstances as to why that dishonest act happened, and the nature of the conduct. Is it a serious dishonest act? Is it, as I said before, a minor indiscretion that really doesn't harm the reputation of the employer at all? So that's what the court assesses. And, for many employees, exercises of poor judgment certainly should not be just cause for dismissal, and they're not. An employer does not have a right to dismiss an employee or terminate an employee for a cause where they've simply exercised poor judgment. And so they're protected by the courts in those circumstances.
And as they should be, quite frankly. I mean, we come back to the point, you're absolutely right. Nobody is perfect. And if imperfection were cause for termination, we'd have a lot of fired people walking around because everybody makes mistakes. The question is it a mistake or is it on purpose? That's the fundamental issue. And where is that oftentimes revealed? The consciousness of guilt, if you will, is a good indicator of intention, of wrongful intention in the first place. So the evidence of the cover-up, generally speaking, is evidence of a consciousness of guilt, and an evidence that the person who did the bad deed, whatever it might be, knew it was a bad deed when they were doing it and purposefully did it, even though they knew that what they were doing was wrong. That is almost to my mind, the definition of intent for the purposes of a crime or what have you. Did I know what I was doing? Did I intend to do it? And if I cover it up, I mean, there's lots of reasons, I suppose, why people cover it up. But when you look at this particular case and we talk about the fairly minor amount of money that was involved, this is not something like, oh my God, if I admit to this, I'm going to have to write a check for hundreds of thousands of dollars, which I don't have. We're talking about a sandwich. And we're talking about half the bill. What I think was €100, something under €100 expensive account. So let's say it was €50, half of that. I mean, someone's going to gamble their job and they're going to double down on this for what is effectively $30. That is, talk about a bad judgment. Boy, that's bad judgment. But it's bad judgment that reveals a dishonest intention in the first place.
No, and look, this case really has life lessons, just beyond the employer-employee relationship, in my view. You make a mistake doing something, fess up to it, right? Or if somebody asks you about it, admit that you made the mistake. Why hide the mistake or allow it to continue to fester? There's, somebody gave me this great quote in the practice of law. And, it may be a little bit cruel or not everybody's going to like it, but the phrase is, if you're going to eat crow, make sure you eat it while it's young and tender, right? Don't let it grow up to be an adult where it's going to be a lot worse. So
yeah, well, this was a crow sandwich, that's for sure.
But
it wasn't young or tender by the time he ate it.
Look, in the Canadian context, this case may have been very interesting to have been litigated here. Certainly if I was representing the financial analyst, one of the cases that really springs to mind and that I've used before in helping our employment lawyers with respect to employees who are dismissed for dishonesty is a Supreme Court of Canada judgment from, it's almost got to be 35 plus years ago, where Chief Justice Dixon basically gives this seminal quote: work is one of the most fundamental aspects in a person's life. It provides the individual with a means of financial support and, as importantly, a contributory role in society. A person's employment is an essential component of his or her sense of identity, self-worth, and emotional well-being. So employment really is, it's a core thing for any person. And when they're challenged with dishonesty in the workplace, I think judges need to be reminded of the value that employment has in anybody's life. And when that kind of an accusation is made against an employee, it can be very hurtful. So I used that case, many years ago. We represented a bank employee who was terminated for dishonesty. We actually won because we used those surrounding circumstances. We used that contextual approach to basically show that that bank employee was actually very highly regarded, had done a great job, but the bank basically had put that employee in a position where they weren't comfortable doing what they had to do, and then had made some mistakes, and they raised dishonesty against that employee. So,
yeah, I think that one of the issues you raise is really important, and you think about it in a larger sense. The more important or valuable the status or relationship is the higher the onus has got to be. You raise a very, very important point. It can't, terminating an employee is not something that should be done cavalierly, because it has such wide ranging ramifications. It's far more than, for most people, their job and their career is far more than a paycheck. And bearing in mind that when you're dismissed for something like dishonesty, that's a stain on your reputation that you're going to carry with you forever. I mean, I don't know this individual at all, but here we are on a podcast coming out of Toronto, Canada, talking about him on this reported case that was reported all over the world. I mean, he is a pariah, I would assume, in the financial services world. I don't know if he's working again. So it's more than just that he lost his job. I mean, this is a very, very serious issue. And so I think the court's treated very seriously. And I think that the necessity that there be actual dishonesty, that there be a finding of bad character, not just bad behavior, explainable bad behavior for bad judgment, or I made a mistake, or what have you, but bad behavior because I meant it to be bad behavior. I knew it was bad and I did it anyways. And when I was caught, I lied about the fact that what I did was bad, because that's even compounding the dishonesty, such that there is no way that this relationship of trust and confidence between the employer and the employee can continue. And I think the court here looked at that appropriately, because they understood the very, very serious ramifications and harm that can come to an employee, far beyond just the fact that they won't get their next paycheck from whatever job they're in, that can result from a finding like this. And I think that that's one of the things that courts need to take into account, and why termination for cause for dishonesty must be proven with evidence that shows that there was that bad intention.
Yeah, and I think just backing up a little bit to the facts of the case as well, before we wrap up here, I think one of the critical factors, and employers should take this to heart, is that you need to have clear policies with respect to whether it's expense accounts, what have you. And that really assisted the bank in this case, that they did have a clear code of conduct, clear policies with respect to what expenses were allowable. And so that's important, because, there are obviously larger companies will have trained legal staff either as in-house counsel or they'll go to outside counsel to have these kinds of policies, but smaller employers may not. And so what they view as dishonesty and then terminate their employee, they'll wind up in court if they don't have clear policies. So that's a lesson on the employer side. And that really, in this case, helped the bank out, because they had that policy and then followed a very clear and a fair process, in my view, in terms of dealing with these expenses.
I agree. And I think that for our listeners, hopefully we put a little bit of detail that was left out of the media story, because, this, as with this and every week on Beneath the Law, we scan the globe for cases you can really sink your teeth into, including the dismissal for the wrongful sandwich. In any event, Stephen, always a pleasure. And always remember, if no one is above the law, then everyone is beneath it.